Hi, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 MLA Colloquium. This year is a little bit different from what we do the other years. It will be entirely online, and we will have three different events. A colloquium first, a keynote speaker next, and finally we will end the day with a social hour to celebrate our graduates. My name is Tristan Cabello. I'm the Associate Director of the Master of Liberal Arts, and I will be introducing the panelists today. The first panel today is about the working papers that students have designed for interdisciplinary graduate research methods. For those of you who don't know, IGRM is a course that is required before you take your capstone course. And this is a course during which you will write a proposal for your capstone course. So those projects are still a work in progress, and we have asked students to give a short presentation of what they have written during this course. And the first presenter today is Chrissy Gardiner, and the title of her presentation is Miskitu Memories and Sandinista Stories, Rumor, Legend, and Civil Conflict in 1980s Nicaragua. Chrissy, we're all ears.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you for putting me first today. So I really started this research project from nothing this past semester. I've been interested in the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua since the whole Iran-Contra thing happened when I was a kid. So I decided I wanted to do something about the Sandinistas. As I was trying to narrow my topic down, I found a few articles about atrocities that were supposedly committed by the Sandinistas against the Miskitu people, who are an indigenous group that lives along the east coast of Nicaragua. That got me thinking about why an idealistic left-wing revolutionary group like the Sandinistas would be at odds with the indigenous people to this extent. I started digging into the reasons for the conflict, and I started seeing lots of rumors and misinformation floating around. So this brought me about to my research question, which ended up being, what role did rumors and misinformation play in creating the conditions for armed disagreement between the indigenous Miskitu people of eastern Nicaragua and the Sandinista government in the early 1980s? One of the main things I want to accomplish with this research is to really dig into how misinformation, like rumors or propaganda, can throw gasoline on a fire, so to speak, and end up making a situation that could have been resolved turn into something really ugly. In the case of the Sandinistas and the Miskitu, my preliminary research implies that the real flare-up of the conflict started over a map having to do with Miskitu land claims. This is a map that very few people actually saw, but lots of people were talking about. And then this map led to the arrest and jailing of several indigenous leaders. And during one of these arrests, there was actually a shootout between the Miskitu and the Sandinistas in a church, with 8 people ending up dead. And this is one example of how a rumor can potentially contribute to a serious conflict. In addition to getting things rolling, there are several rumors I found which could arguably be said to have prolonged the conflict. One that I talk about in my research proposal is the conditions that the Miskitu people endured when they were being moved from their homes along the Nicaragua-Honduras border into concentration camps further into Nicaragua to get them away from the fighting. The rumor circulating among the Miskitu was that it was sort of a death march, with people forced to leave their homes and walk for days without food or water, and anyone who could not keep up would be shot or just left for dead. Supposedly as many as 1,500 people died on this trek. The person relating this rumor was not actually there on the walk, so he's repeating the information that was circulating at the time, which understandably would have gotten the Miskitus who heard it pretty upset. A human rights organization went to Nicaragua after the war to try and find evidence of this and other rumored atrocities, and couldn't find any solid evidence that the Sandinistas had been indiscriminately killing large numbers of Miskitu like this. But regardless of what actually happened, a rumor like this could inspire people to stay angry and keep fighting. In my preliminary research, I used a number of memoirs and ethnographies, some letters and speeches from the 1980s, along with a few newspaper and magazine articles and a bunch of journal articles. The topic of the Sandinista-Miskitu conflict has been well researched, which is a mixed blessing because I have a ton of material to work with. But due to the nature of my topic, it's hard to eliminate any sources because when looking for rumors, they can be hiding anywhere. For my main research, I've been heavily using 3 books, including 2 memoirs and 1 ethnography. The first memoir, Rafaga, the life story of a Nicaraguan Miskitu comandante, was written by Ronaldo Reyes, a Miskitu who initially joined the Sandinistas, but due to racism, along with the growing suspicion a lot of Sandinistas had against the Miskitus, he got thrown in jail as a counter-revolutionary. This drove him to join the actual counter-revolutionaries, and he led a group of Miskitu who were loosely aligned with the Contras in Honduras. He eventually decided that they were being used by Reagan to justify Contra fighting, and were not getting any closer to resolving the land dispute, which was at the heart of the Miskitu fight with the Sandinistas in the first place. So he started negotiating for peace. The other memoir is called Blood on the Border and was written by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, an Indigenous rights activist and historian who spent a lot of time in Nicaragua during the 1980s trying to figure out why the Sandinistas, who she was highly supportive of, were supposedly doing all of these terrible things to the Miskitu. Her book really digs into the propaganda that was floating around, much of which was created and spread by the US. The main ethnography I've used so far is called Resistance and Contradiction, Miskitu Indians and the Nicaraguan State, 1894 to 1987, by Charlie Hale, a North American anthropologist who lived in Nicaragua for several years and actually worked for the Sandinista government studying the Miskitu people in the midst of the war. The area where he did his main ethnographic work for this book was Sandinista territory, but it was surrounded by areas controlled by the Contras. So he was in the thick of it and really saw both sides. The main difficulty of my research is the inability to actually go to Nicaragua and interview people myself. I'm relying entirely on written materials gathered by other people, and I have not found anyone focusing specifically on rumors or misinformation. So it's hit or miss whether the kind of information I'm looking for has been included in a particular source. In fact, sources may be leaving out rumors because they are unverified, which makes it even more important for me to get my hands on every single source I can find. The other difficulty with this project is the lack of material written by Miskitus themselves. Nearly all of the published writing dealing with the Miskitu-Sandinista conflict or on Miskitu history was written by white anthropologists or missionaries. Charlie Hale addresses this to some extent in his ethnography, but it is a definite issue that almost all of the information about the Miskitu is written by outsiders. This is why Rafaga is a rare primary source. In writing about the Miskitu as yet another outsider, I will need to be very careful not to make ethnocentric assumptions or conclusions in my final project. So as to how this fits into my MLA studies, it's actually my first term in the MLA program, so I kind of hit the ground running here. Ultimately, I would like to apply to a history doctoral program after I finish my MLA. So this project fits really nicely into that goal. The fact that I also get to do a little psychology while investigating how rumor theory applies to this situation, and anthropology as I look into the history of the Miskitu and how some of their folklore and mythology shaped their reaction to the Sandinistas, helps make my work a bit more well-rounded and ultimately, I think, a better historian when I get to my PhD program. Thanks, everyone.
Yay.
Excellent presentation, Chrissy. Thank you so much. And it was also very much on time, so that's great. Next up is Paul Ludwig, and just so everybody know, in the audience, everybody, you will be able to ask questions at the end of the panel. Okay. Paul Ludwig will be presenting a presentation entitled "Is the Social Contract Appropriate for the 21st Century?" Paul, we all ears.
So my name is Paul Ludwig. I would like to thank Dr. Cabello for the invitation to be part of this 2021 MLA Colloquium and everyone that supports these events. It's a privilege to have been invited. So a little background about myself. 27 years spent in the military, 11 years with Defense Intelligence Agency, my bachelor's degree in humanities from the University of Maryland. And I'm due to graduate at the end of the summer semester from Johns Hopkins MLA program. I started researching this topic during Dr. Cabello's Interdisciplinary Research Graduate Methods class, and I began to compare it to the fracturization that I see going on in our society. Over the last 20 years or so, the ability to govern our country has become bogged down. Party dogma and the people of the United States seem to have become more of the game of the day. I began to wonder if the 21st century had started similarly to that of the Industrial Revolution. I also began thinking about researching how that applies to our founders' socio-political roots. And what I found was that the political agreement, the social contract that was envisioned by Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau was not the arrangement that we have today. So that started me asking the question, do we need a social contract for the 21st century? So on this slide, you can see some quotes from John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau regarding the state of nature. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's most famous line is out of his book, The Social Contract, is man is more free and everywhere he's in chains. I'm going to use his theory of the social contract because I feel it's the most mature theory regarding the concerns of legitimacy of the authority of the state over the individual, and the fact it was written in 1762, it had a direct impact in the American Revolution. His social contract or principle of political right, written in 1762, can be broken down into 4 parts. The first of which is a waiver of our natural rights in favor of the state. Rousseau believed that justice cannot be defined as just the right of the stronger. Justice consists of individual acts in agreement with civil authority. Individuals are, in his mind, obligated to act as if that authority is legitimate. The second thing is that people must have a backup through the legislature. The general will being against the interest groups of the time. Everyone may have a particular will, but each individual's inclination is obliged to submit to the general will as part of this contract. To fight against special interest groups or individuals wishing to monopolize the general will and divert it to their advantage, Rousseau envisioned an institution orientated towards the common good, and that would be the legislature. He also believed a creation of a state religion or a civic religion used as a public profession of faith that aims to teach political values and prescribes dogma, rites, and rituals that the citizens are required to follow. In this next slide, I want us to look at rethinking the social contract for the 21st century. We can mitigate risks to individuality and privacy, as well as streamline access to both the government and also improve its performance. We need to rethink the roles and responsibilities of all citizens, workers, employees, and the government. If we do this, I believe equality and long-term prosperity can begin to reemerge. And with that, we can attempt to reassure each American that they'll get a better, more fair deal. So how did we get here? How did I get here? So I'm a big fan of President Theodore Roosevelt. And so I've been studying a lot of his administration policies. And what I found was that he believed in 3 conditions that he needed to meet or attempt to address in order to meet his obligation for the social contract. And that was control the corporations, provide oversight of consumer and worker protections, as well as the conservation of natural resources. These were his 3 staple efforts. And in today's world, we kind of see markets as no longer being separate from or even opposed to civil society. Citizens see themselves more influential participants in the governance of our nation, and there's obviously a more strong desire for active citizenship involved in all public affairs. And it does seem that we are looking for some sort of a moral compass to move forward into the 21st century. I believe that a new 21st century social contract can create social progress through four distinctive but interrelated purposes: humanist, civic, educational, and political. The humanist being the development of individual and collective human virtues. I don't think that that is addressed enough in our public education system. And I think it needs to be re-emphasized in order to become more beneficial in the influence of our social progress. Civically, we need to become more active and enhance our participation in democratic society. We need increased civic activity to create a more politically aware group of individuals so that the interest of the outcomes of our politics more align with the wishes of our country. Educational, we need to provide individuals with intellectual and practical skills, allowing them to find dignified yet essential contributions and enhance their general living conditions. And the political arena, we need to look at furthering more social equity and justice. We need to consider new standards of how we measure equal recognition under the law, as well as social opportunities. And in conclusion, I would like to basically explore whether the government should require literal consent in order to agree to be governed. I think the new social contract should support individual efforts of self-improvement, as well as reevaluate the role and function of corporate America as it pertains to social responsibility. Obviously, my source material will consist of the original writings of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, as well as Theodore Roosevelt and his political philosophy, and see how it applies to the modern evolution that we've come to in the 21st century. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their attention, and I hope you all have a good day.
Thank you so much, Paul. So next up is Israel Bitton, and the title of his presentation is Chosen for Hate and Love, a qualitative explanatory analysis of the NYPD data on anti-Jewish hate crimes. Israel, we are all ears.
Thank you. Thank you. First, before I get into the details of my study, I would just begin with by prefacing with a basic truth that I think we're all aware of when it comes to diseases. The first step to curing a disease is recognizing its existence. The second is studying it to develop treatments, and the third is to actually treat it. But there's one disease that many of the afflicted fail to recognize, and doctors fail to study, diagnose, and treat. The disease I speak of is not COVID, it's not cancer, AIDS, or heart disease, all terrible in their own right. The disease I'm here to speak about is anti-Semitism, also known as Jew hate. This pernicious disease has afflicted hearts and minds for more than 2 millennia, causing untold masses to engage directly in anti-Jewish violence or to support it tacitly. These symptoms of this disease, also known as the longest hatred, which putrefies the human heart, can be discerned in several ways. One is the expressions of hate and calls for violence against the Jewish collective. The second is scapegoating the Jewish collective. The third is actually perpetrating the violence. And the fourth is justifying the violence against some Jews in one place because of supposedly bad actions by Jews in another. My dear colleagues, this disease has existed and till now almost unchanged, though not without mutating to assume new guises and presenting us with many serious anomalies. The anomalies can be found in anti-Jewish hate crime data, whether it's from the FBI or the NYPD. My study focused on the NYPD's data, although the FBI data shows there's a clear parallel between national and local statistics. With just a cursory glance of the NYPD's 2019 data, anyone ought to immediately and easily find the following anomaly. In a city with an estimated 8.5 million residents, Jews who represent 13% of the total population, that's 1.1 million, which is the largest Jewish population of any city in the world, including Israel, account on average for some 60% of all hate crime victims. The trend is even more alarming when considering that on the national scale, the rate of victimization remains the same despite Jews constituting less than 2% of the total American population. To put that in local perspective, New York City's population is also 25% Black and 11% Muslim, yet those groups represent 8.5% and 2.85% of hate crime victims, respectively. What that produces are hate crime occurrence rates per group that range from 1 in every 58,000 Blacks, 1 in 70,000 Muslims, but when it comes to Jews, it's 1 in every 4,545 Jews. Back to the medical metaphor for a moment. This, the phenomenon of disproportionate targeting, is the first major symptom that's easily detectable, suggesting there's a serious and dangerous cause. One would think that if there was a disease that was adversely affecting a particular segment of the population to such an anomalously high degree, medical researchers would be all over it. They would examine the disease's genetic structure, trace every mutant strain, and work to find a cure, or at the very least a treatment that could mitigate against its worst consequences. But curiously, in this scenario, that's not the case, and that is a second major symptom. Anti-Jewish hate crimes are one of the least studied areas across the disciplines of sociology and criminology, despite being at the top of the charts in every single year since the FBI and NYPD began recording hate crimes in the mid-90s. What that yields is a reality whereby anti-Semites are either in denial about their hatred and therefore don't seek help, or they're self-aware anti-Semites who find very few doctors willing to even recognize their symptoms as problematic or diagnose the existence of the disease, or let alone treat it. Now, I'm wondering, who are these doctors that are sworn, proverbial doctors, sworn to the Hippocratic Oath, that treat every segment of the population the same when it comes to hate crimes, but for one? And why would they differentiate their treatment? These are the questions I've been asking myself as I've been conducting my research on the nature of hate crimes, the etiologies of hate, and specifically the phenomenon of disproportionate victimization. My analysis focused on one of the only studies on anti-Jewish hate crimes in New York City, which I contrasted with my own qualitative analysis and a quantitative analysis, very simple and straightforward, yielding some insights that were missed by this one study. In her 2020 study, A Common Target, Anti-Jewish Hate Crime in New York City Communities, 1995 to 2010, Colleen E. Mills, an assistant professor of criminal justice at Penn State, begins her study on the NYPD hate crime data by acknowledging and affirming the dearth of research on anti-Jewish hate crimes, before adding that, quote, such a scarcity of research persists despite anti-Jewish hate crime consistently accounting for a majority of religious-based hate crimes. Thus, with that one statement, Mills affirmed the existence of the two primary symptoms detectable in and around the NYPD hate crime data: the disproportionate Jewish victimization and its disproportionate academic neglect. Yet, though she alluded to those two symptoms, she did not emphasize them. And the reason is that Mills conducted a study to understand what the predictors of anti-Jewish hate crimes might be. She employed two different known theories, one called defended neighborhoods and the other social disorganization, one that says any majority population tends to defend their neighborhood from what they see as encroachment of newcomers, and social disorganization says that where there is a lack of communal cohesion, there will likely be more crime. The issue with this is that rather than trying to find these predictors, what the study showed was that the number one predictor was not whether the area was higher or lower in affluence, or the majority or minority population, what the distribution was. Simply, if you were Jewish, you had a higher chance of being targeted anywhere. Furthermore, because she was looking for predictors rather than into the actual data, she missed several insights that are readily apparent. Namely that in this study here, what she missed in the NYPD data from 2019 is that in addition to just Jews being the number one targeted group, they were actually targeted in 80% of police precincts. 80%. The other groups, the two groups most targeted after Jews, were attacked in 35% and 30% respectively. So here we have someone who's looking for predictors to understand what is it that is leading to hate crimes, when in reality the data is showing that if you're a Jew, it has nothing to do with if you're defending your neighborhood and you're a majority, or you're a minority entering the neighborhood if the neighborhood is affluent or lacks social cohesion. Jews have and always will be the target. The other aspect that she failed to account for, which again is in the 2019 data, a simple look finds it, is that Jews are the only group that are victimized by other minorities, not only to a high degree, but to the highest degree, where in New York City, it's the majority of assailants are not white supremacists, they're other minority groups. It's the only minority group, whether it's in the FBI data or the NYPD data, where we can see such an anomaly. So what we end up having is a scenario where this is supposedly being studied, when in fact, we are not yielding any real insight because the data is not being explored fully. And just a moment. Right, and there can be many hypotheses on why this is the case. And part of my study, which is in development, this was a cursory look at 2019. Mills looked at a lot more data, but the data is pretty consistent, whether it's across the FBI or the NYPD data. And one has to wonder why this is the case. Why is the case that when researchers who look at data, we look for anomalies, we look at what literally flies off the charts. In this case, what's flying off the charts is not garnering the response that would be considered typical. One example is we've seen a spike in the past year and a half of anti-Asian hate crimes. And we've seen also a public outcry. We've seen the hashtags. Now that number is, there's a clear increase, and every attack is horrible, but it pales in comparison to anti-Jewish crimes. And yet we don't hear the same outcry. We don't hear the same responses. And just to finish up, one of my theories, if you will, is because of this process where we don't want to identify every type of hate crime against Jews because it may or may not be convenient politically, reinforces the hate criminals, because there is no deterrence, there is no reaction, there's nothing to suggest to them that this is actually wrong. And where they do describe these the motives for hate crimes, if it's a white person, they'll say it's white supremacy. If it's anything else, there's a list of grievances. Well, it's gentrification, it's one thing or another. So this is the path that I've been on in exploration, and hope to have some better answers in due time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Israel. It was really great. It was a great presentation. Next up, we have D.H. Covey, and D.H. will present on the will to evolve intelligent cell directives for mutation. D.H., the floor is yours.
Okay, hello, and thank you for having me. And my name is D.H. Covey. And my research question is, what is the source of species-specific evolutionary mutations which are too critically efficient to be the result of stochastic processes of natural selection? In other words, why are genetic evolutionary mutations so specifically pertinent for the purposes of homeostasis? I hope that my research will clarify that homeostasis is the result of the purpose and process of mutation and evolution as being a cellular, consciously directed genetic reaction to environmental stimuli. As of now, we recognize Darwin's theory of natural selection as the main process of evolution. However, Darwin's theory is based on the random occurrence of genetic mutations that may or may not benefit the organism. It is more of a process of the organism adapting to the mutation. I think that many evolutionary mutations are very specifically beneficial and must be direct responses to environmental stimuli, making them reflective results of epigenetic characteristics. I'm inspired by Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species of 1859 and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's Philosophie zoologique of 1809. And one of the books that I have studied concerning transgenerational epigenetic inheritance is Lamarck's signature, How Retrogenes Are Changing Darwin's Natural Selection Paradigm, written by Steele, Lindley, and Blandon and printed in 1998. These authors claim that the key to somatic cell transgenerational heritable mutation occurs during the process of reverse transcription. In Lamarck Rises from the Grave, Parental Environment Induced Epigenetic Inheritance in Model Organisms and Humans, authors Wang, Liu, and Sun claim that during the susceptible periods of gametogenesis, anti-epigenetic information that escapes reprogramming is a plausible transgenerational carrier of environmental information. I also refer to cellular sonomic measurements and cognition-based evolution and biological evolution as defense of self. Both articles are written by Miller, Torti, and Beluska in 2020 and 2019, respectively. Both articles appeared in the journal Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology. These authors share more of a philosophical approach to biological evolution as a defensive tactic of protecting an organism's homeostasis. As for studies in cellular intelligence, I refer to researchers such as Brian J. Ford, also published in Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology, and the writings of Jonathan C.W. Edwards on single cellular consciousness, information gathering, and sharing. Okay, I also refer to some writings and lectures of Pradeep Ghosh on cellular intelligence. And finally, I am inspired by the many species-specific evolutionary adaptations in the animal kingdom. One of my biggest challenges is that when people realize that I am questioning Darwin, they tend to stop processing what I am saying, and they revert to a reflexive reaction of dogmatic self-defense. They do not want to question the dogma of either Darwin or August Weismann, who theorized that a tissue now known as the Weismann barrier prevents epigenetic influence as a heritable genetic influence. However, Darwin himself eventually considered environmentally influenced epigenetic inheritance. For example, in a letter to Moritz Wagner in 1876, he said that not considering the effects of environmental influences on evolution was his greatest error. My next steps in my research include more research on the most up-to-date developments in the area of cellular intelligence and the application of interdisciplinary sources of information in my research. I intend to present this work as my graduate thesis and to eventually present this work as a book. This work reflects the philosophical influence of my graduate studies, hence the title, The Will to Evolve, which is homage to Nietzsche's The Will to Power. The proficiency that I lack in scientific knowledge and expertise is counterbalanced by my philosophical speculations and interpretations. Being able to write about this subject is a major motivation for my achieving my MLA. Now I will read a selection from the abstract of my paper, The Will to Evolve, Intelligent Cell Directives for Mutation. Including DNA reproduction and RNA transcription, the design of every process which sustains the homeostasis of the living cell and its host organism is deliberately and precisely orchestrated, leaving nothing to chance, which suggests that genetic mutation is also the result of deliberate biological instructions for homeostatic adaptability to environmental factors. However, a void exists in the understanding of cellular manipulation of epigenetic adaptive traits being processed into genetically heritable mutations. Heritable genetic mutation is a process which has been traditionally considered a random and stochastic process. However, could intelligent cell decision making be a biological source that directs responsive actions for cellular and genetic adaptation to environmental stimuli? Recent discoveries of intelligent cellular responses suggest that cellular comprehension of environmental changes stimulates intelligent cell directives to encode germ cells with epigenetic modification traits which result in species-specific evolutionary mutations. And that concludes what I have to say about my research project. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, DH. That was a great presentation. And now the floor is open for questions. Attendees, panelists, if you have questions, you can ask questions to the presenters. And in order to get the ball rolling here, I start by asking a question to Chrissy. Chrissy, you are talking a lot about rumors in your proposal. And my question, from one historian to the other, is how do we document rumors, as historians, and how do we find what rumors were like? And once a rumor has been in print, is it still a rumor?
Well, that's an excellent question. The way that I approached finding rumors was just reading through everything I could find. And a rumor is basically anything that is unsubstantiated. So it's not necessarily false and it's not necessarily true, but it's something that has not been proven necessarily. So there are, I would say, rumor, the way that I defined it was just things that people were saying that either had conflicting information elsewhere or was said in a slightly different way somewhere else. But yeah, it's studying rumors as a historian is really interesting because sometimes these rumors turn into facts. Yeah. And so they just sort of they get repeated enough times that people think, okay, this is how it was. Yeah. But then when you start digging into it, you realize, no, that was just what people were saying at the time. So it's really fun to dig into that kind of information.
Yeah, very, very good answer. Yeah. And the idea also that when rumors, go into print, they are now part, of the public discourse, so we have to make sure that we use that, as part of our narrative too. Whether this is a rumor or not, this is in print, so this is part of the public discourse, and that needs to be studied for the historians. Thank you so much, Chrissy. Any other questions for the panelists here?
I have a question for DH,
Sure.
if he's there.
Yes,
I think she's right. Yeah.
So you were speaking about epigenetic influence in the biological evolutionary process. Is that kind of snapshot of what I'm hearing?
Yes.
So my question, because you mentioned a sense of consciousness about it, would you, and the reason I ask is I'm actually tossing around this question in my head. I have been for a year or so. But do you consider the ability to sense and adapt strictly based on environment to be part of, or a level of consciousness that isn't really recognized as sophisticated enough as ours, but still meets the criteria of consciousness?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying.
But you and me need to sit down and chat, because that's another area I'd really interested in.
Well, I have tons and tons of information on that, and in my proposal, and what I'm going to do in my paper is not only talk about the steps between epigenetic inheritance as being reflective of environmental stimuli, but also the actual process of cellular decision-making, which is a form of consciousness. And people like C.W. Edwards takes that a little step further by saying even our neurology is not a total working mechanism. He doesn't recognize a binding process. He thinks the reason we can perceive all manner of things at one time is because each cell actually has perception of everything at all times. So he doesn't distinguish between, seeing and hearing as being different, responses, reactions.
Right. No,
Yeah,
I mean,
if I can just interrupt you guys, and I would love for you to discuss all of this.
Sorry.
No, this is totally okay. But we have many questions in the chat, so I just want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to answer the questions. Israel, we have a question from Lee here for you, and the question is, why do you think anti-Semitism is still overlooked in the ways you have proposed?
So one of the areas I was looking at was converse to the disproportionate targeting was the lack of consideration of Jews as victims. And the reason for that, that's why I put in my title chosen for hate and love, because there's a lot of anomalies here. The other side of Jews being the primary target for hate crimes is that I think it was a Pew Research poll, or I forget exactly which one, shows that in terms of the index of good feelings that people have, Jews score pretty high. So there is something going on here where Jews as a group, because of notions of success and actually because of some of the anti-Semitic tropes of them being, financially success, controlling Hollywood, controlling the media, all of that goes into saying, well, Jews, they can't really be victims. So that's why also we get explanations for the hate crimes rather than outright condemnations. There's no excuse. It's wrong, but. So I think all of that contributes to a variety of reasons why people may not want to touch it, may not even realize that it's worth exploring.
Yeah, very good answer. Yeah. Paul, I had a question for you, just out of curiosity. Like, who do you think, right now in, the American political landscape represents, the type of social contract that you would like to offer in the future?
It's interesting because obviously the top 10 hit list of politicians out there can be pretty extreme either way. You look at it. What I would propose is maybe a merging of an Andrew Yang with a Rand Paul kind of philosophies, if you kind of smash them together and come out with something on the other side that kind of meets a more equitable contract for everyone.
Very good. Okay. Thank you so much. So I just wanted to thank you all and thank all the panelists. Those were really great presentations. The great frustration of those panels, of course, is that we could keep on discussing your great topics for hours, but we have to stop at some point. But you did very well on time, and so I want to thank you for that. We will come back. We'll take a short break, a short 5-minute break, and we'll come back at 2:50 for our second panel. Thank you very much.
This is Dr. Laura DeSisto, the director of the MLA program, and I am going to be moderating the second session for today's MLA Colloquium. And I also wanted to just take a quick moment to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. Dr. Cabello and I appreciate it, and of course, we know that our students do as well. So the second session of the day is going to involve presentations of research projects that students completed during their MLA elective courses. And so we have two presentations for you today. The first one is going to be from Marla Shavitz, and it's called Historiography, Gender, and the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And she worked on this project as a part of her class experience in one of our core courses called What is History, taught by Dr. Cabello.
And thank you for the great introduction. That was literally what I was going to say. So I'll just jump right into my presentation. So the origin story of the Montgomery bus boycott has been told in two ways. There is one way the majority of the American public either learned it in school or just feels like they know it. Historians have been writing another more nuanced version about Rosa Parks and her refusal to give up her seat on the bus for decades. And subsequently, the post-2000 historians have included other women involved in the boycott as part of the origin story. This presentation will address the way the evolution of this event has been told, as well as the different aspects of the historiographical problem. That is, the glossing over of a more complete history of the women actors, as well as the backstory of violence against Black women, and offers evidence for the reasons the shift has taken place. When looking at the historiography on this topic, there are clues to the richness of the story that unfolds in each decade of historical writing. While seminal works on the subject focus on the role of Martin Luther King Jr. and other male leaders of the movement, post-2000 scholarship has shifted attention to Black female suffering leading up to the event and organization and activism that contributed to the boycott. Shifts in historiography in the 1960s and 70s towards stories of the people who lived the events, away from male-dominated history, away from white-centric history, and toward a body of work that is more inclusive of the people involved and the underlying reasons why they were willing to take on personal sacrifice in the name of civil rights, contribute to the scholarship of the 21st century historians. And this picture on the right here is of Laura, one of the historians that I'll talk about, McGuire and Ressie Taylor, and Allison Berg is another historian I'll mention in the presentation. So this new historiography includes more powerful visceral reasons that led to the boycott than being tired after a long day's work and wanting to sit near the front of the bus. The shift, mainly led by women historians, adds nuance and complexities alluded to, but not fully formed in previous scholarship. Shifts in civil rights historiography occurred in the 1980s in the popular realm, with historians noting the significance of David Garrow's collective works on Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement, as well as PBS's award-winning 1987 documentary, Eyes on the Prize. While important to mention that these are often cited, it is also important to note that these works fail to analyze the sexual politics of racial struggle. New sources began to emerge in the 1980s that allowed for historians in the early 21st century to address the nuance of sex, violence, and gender, as well as the complication of the tired lady on the bus narrative. Historian Allison Berg wrote in 2009 of 3 memoirs of significance. You see these biographies here. Berg states the importance of these, which she calls memory texts that illuminates the complex relationship between individual testimony and cultural memory. Cultural memory is powerful and difficult to change. Historians in the 1970s were calling for change. Frances M. Beale wrote in 1975 in Slave of a Slave No More, Black Women in Struggle, on the shift from the 1960s. She wrote, "Until quite recently, Afro-American people had been denied their history, or even worse, had been subjected to history books and treaties filled with distortions and lies, either by commission or by omission." Beale addresses in her writing the abhorrent sexual violence perpetrated against Black women, yet the societal pressure to be seen as upstanding and respectable. This is an important point, and I'll come back to this. She wrote of Black women in general, "As a woman, she has seen her physical image defamed and has been the object of the white master's uncontrollable lust and subjected to all the ideals of white womanhood as a model to which she should aspire." Also writing in the 1970s, Barrow Caroline Graham looked at 8 different children's encyclopedias published after 1971 to show how Black women were portrayed. Graham states, "Perhaps no other woman throughout the history of American literature has continually been depicted in as demeaning, negative, in racial stereotypes as the Black American woman. Both physically and mentally, the Black woman has been described as the unattractive, obese, domineering, breadwinner, uneducated individual." It's noteworthy to mention Graham's research uncovered Rosa Parks was listed in only one of those 8 encyclopedias. In 1991, Herbert Cole, the founder of the open classroom movement, wrote of visiting an elementary school and observing a student play about Rosa Parks. His account harkens back to the stereotypes Graham describes in the children's encyclopedias a decade and a half prior. He recalled, "The children's visualization of Rosa Parks, whom they felt free to call by her first name, was particularly distressing. They imagined her to be poor, without education or sophistication, a person who acted on impulse and emotion rather than intelligence and moral conviction. There was no sense of her as a community leader or as part of an organized struggle against oppression. I decided to find out how common this view was and have been astonished to find that those children's view of Rosa Parks is not at all different from that of most European American adults and almost all the school children I have questioned." Cole calls this story Rosa Parks the Tired, and like other historians before him, called for a shift in the historiography, stating, "The generic story reveals some distressing characteristics that serve to turn an organized and carefully planned movement for social change into a spontaneous outburst based upon frustration and anger." Respectability, a trait alluded to in Beale's 1975 article, cannot be underestimated as a critical factor needed to break down resistance to segregation in the white community. It's why Rosa Parks, rather than Claudette Colvin or Mary Louise Smith before her, was chosen as a test case for the bus boycott. It's why Martin Luther King Jr. in his Holt Street address framed her character as beyond reproach, setting her up to become the mother of the movement. Of Parks, King said, "Nobody can doubt the height of her character. Nobody can doubt the depth of her Christian commitment and devotion to the teachings of Jesus." Historian Kurt Wilson pointed out King's speech diffused, or at least redefined, the full radicalism of Parks' defiance. Wilson also noted how the mother metaphor is not only an honor, but he says also signifies a narrative that constitutes our public memory. He states Park became Madonna-like. The adherence to the era of respectability almost prevented one of Rosa Parks's personal essays from being released to the public. The essay was part of a series of private documents sold to an auction house 5 years after her death. The essay described a potential assault while she was working as a domestic in 1931 by a man she called Mr. Charlie, a generic and pejorative name African-American women called white men. Danielle McGuire, one of the post-2000 civil rights revisionists, writes of the sexual violence women of the era experienced and explains the controversy and significance of the essay. By dismissing the essay as private and or imagined, she says, it virtually silenced any discussion about how the iconic civil rights activist may have been subject to and even testified about sexual violence and what it meant for the development of her political, racial, and gender consciousness, her movement activism, and how we remember her today. Parks did not publish the essay, talk about the experience, or include it in her memoir. McGuire states that there may be reason for this and refers to a concept many of the post-2000 writers cite, the culture of dissemblance. On Parks, McGuire says, she may have also kept the story private to maintain her respectability. The culture of dissemblance among Black women refers to the appearance of openness and disclosure while shielding the truth of their inner lives and selves from their oppressors. This desire to control the narrative by fighting the release of this essay shows the resistance to shifts in historiography. As McGuire states, it speaks to ongoing issues of power and control over Black women's bodies, their history, and the way we remember the powerful women who helped lead the modern civil rights movement. McGuire is one of those historians complicating the neat and tidy story of Rosa the Tired. She uses the stories of non-famous people in Montgomery, such as Gertrude Perkins and Ressie Taylor, who refused to keep silent about their sexual assaults by white men. In Gertrude Perkins' case, the police. Telling the reader, they testify about their assaults, leaving behind critical evidence that historians must find courage to analyze. This fits the three traits historian Sarah Mazza puts forth as microhistory. It concerns a non-famous person or group of people. It centers around a crisis, and the author uses the story to make a point about some broader historical question. In this case, the relation between Black women's activism and the role of violence against Black women. The role that violence against Black women played in the decision to begin and sustain the Montgomery bus boycott. The aim of my paper for the What is History class was to show the evolution of the historiography of the Rosa Parks story. Historians in both the public and academic realms have been bound to the narrative Martin Luther King Jr. set forth in his Holt Street address, or focused on King himself. When Rosa Parks began showing up in the history texts, remember of 8 encyclopedias, only one had an entry on her before 1975. It was a sanitized, whitewashed version of her act of civil disobedience. Historians agree, she was a fine, upstanding citizen. She was the fine, upstanding citizen popular history knows her to be. However, recent scholarship has nuanced her place in history, not as Rosa the Tired or Rosa the accidental hero, but Mrs. Parks, as her biographer noted she liked to be called, the activist, the advocate, the civil rights champion. Before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, her long history of activism played into the act. Mrs. Parks was one of the first African Americans to speak up for Ressie Taylor after she was gang raped by 6 white men. Mrs. Parks convinced Taylor to move to Montgomery after she began receiving death threats. Those who broke the culture of dissemblance have been the subject of post-2000 scholarship. This intersection of the topics of gender, power, and race have added to the complexity to the historiography that is aligning with the broader culture. Biography has been an important tool in catapulting Black women from side notes of history to taking a place of prominence. It is true that there would be no bus boycott without Rosa Parks. However, it is also true there would be no bus boycott without Joanne Gibson Robinson. There have been clues in history to the violence, the struggle, and strong will and perseverance of Black women for decades, written by white and African American authors alike. A new generation of historians is creating a body of work that is powerful and bold. The time has come to tackle these long-held cultural memories tinged with stereotype and put forth into history a narrative on the calculated courage of these women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marla. And just as with the previous session, we'll reserve time for questions and answers after the second presentation is done. That way we can leave as much time as possible to answer as many questions as possible. That was a wonderful presentation. So now I'm going to turn to our second presenter for this session, Karen Costin. Her research project is entitled Why the Equal Rights Amendment Still Matters. And she wrote this project as a part of her time in the course, The Shape of Things, the Embodiment of Sexuality in American Culture, I believe is the full title, with Dr. Kimberly Rose Pendleton. All right, Karen, I'll allow you to go ahead and start your presentation.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Karen Costin, and this is my paper on why the Equal Rights Amendment still matters. I've done a little updating to reflect some of the changes since the original paper was submitted, so hopefully it's a little bit more up to date. In this paper, I will discuss how women's bodies are more regulated than firearms, that it's been 100 years since women were given the right to vote, yet we are still not treated equally. Women make less than men and are marginalized or excluded from the public sphere and subordinate in the private sphere. The movement began in 1848 with a women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. This was not the first meeting in support of women's rights, but was viewed later as the meeting that launched the movement. The U.S. National Archives and Records state the 19th Amendment guarantees American women the right to vote. Achieving this milestone required a lengthy and difficult struggle. Victory took decades of agitation. Beginning in the mid-19th century, women suffrage supporters lectured, wrote, marched, lobbied, and practiced civil disobedience to achieve what many Americans considered radical change. Between 1878, when the amendment was first introduced in Congress, and 1920, when it was ratified, champions of voting rights for women worked tirelessly, but their strategies varied. Some tried to pass suffrage acts in the states. Others challenged male-only voting laws in the courts. More public tactics included parades, silent vigils, and hunger strikes. Supporters were heckled, jailed, and sometimes physically abused. The Night of Terror from History.com describes an incident when women were beaten by prison guards in 1917. 33 women brought to Algonquin on the night of November 14th demanded to be treated as political prisoners. Instead, prison superintendent called on his guards to teach the women a lesson. Bursting into the room where they were waiting to be booked, the guards dragged them down the hall and threw them into dark, filthy cells. Lucy Burns had her hands shackled to the top of a cell, forcing her to stand all night. The guards also threatened her with a straitjacket and a buckle gag. Dora Lewis lost consciousness after her head was smashed into an iron bed. And Alice Kosu, seeing Lewis's assault, suffered a heart attack and didn't get medical attention until the following morning. On May 21st, 1919, the House of Representatives passed the amendment, and 2 weeks later, the Senate followed. When Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment on August 18, 1920, the amendment was adopted. The face of the American electorate had changed forever. It took another 53 years after that amendment for the ERA amendment to be passed by Congress in 1972. It states, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." Seems like a simple enough statement and that it would have been ratified by all the states right away. In the first year after it passed, 30 of the states did. Then it stopped. Why the slowdown? Why didn't the other states ratify it immediately? This is where the Christian Coalition and right-wing conservative groups come into the picture. Formed in the 1970s as anti-feminists who questioned the loss of traditional family values, they brought fear into the conversation around loss of privileges for women. Phyllis Schlafly, the leader of two opponent organizations, was against the amendment, saying it was too broad, could eliminate any government distinctions, including the things that I've listed here. Of that list, we have unisex bathrooms, a more balanced alimony system, accessibility to abortions, and same-sex marriages now. Women can join the military voluntarily, and female Catholic priests, while I don't believe they are likely to happen in my lifetime, I really don't think that would be such a bad thing, since religion is an area that could use some equal rights enforcement. In 2020, Democrats took majority in the General Assembly for the state of Virginia and became the 38th and final state needed to ratify the amendment. In doing so, they have set up a new set of legal battles. Congress must eliminate the original deadline, and a joint resolution was introduced to do just that. The House has passed a bill to remove the deadline, and the vote now goes to the Senate, where it needs 60 votes to pass. The pro-ERA voices maintain that the amendment would force states to intervene in matters where the laws are not equal. This would be a major victory for women, since even today the inequalities are prevalent. In a 1999 article, U.S. Representative Carolyn Maloney said that she believed that big business and insurance companies that were concerned with underwriting costs had lobbied against the ERA in states where insurance has a local influence on the economies. This is a great example of exactly why it's important to get the ERA passed. Big business and insurance companies fought against it because they didn't want to pay out equally. This is an example of how we live in a gender democracy. In Carol Pateman's book, The Sexual Contract, she states that the key feature of gender democracy is the separation of the public and private sphere. Women are left marginalized or excluded from the public sphere and subordinate in the private sphere. The ERA addresses the dominance of the public sphere, but does not necessarily challenge the private sphere. The ongoing struggle to pass the ERA is an important node in the ongoing multi-sided movement to build more inclusive and egalitarian models of democracy. Today, women in the United States are still paid less than men for equal levels of work. In a 1999 article, Representative Maloney quoted the Equal Pay Act of 1964, when women earned 59 cents for every dollar a man made. In 1999, women made 79 cents for every dollar a man made. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports from 2019, women receive 81.4% the amount of their male counterparts. In 1971, at the ERA Symposium, Rita Hauser discussed several places where women are treated separately and on lesser par with men. She stated that women were still not able to transfer title to real property, enter into business without the consent of their husbands or the court, that the father is the natural guardian of children. Social Security provided for different computations of benefits between men and women, which had been upheld by the federal courts. And under, quote, the guise of protecting the fairer or weaker sex, almost every state has laws which apply to only women in terms of the hours they may work, the fields in which they may work, and the conditions under which they may work, end quote. Most of these areas that Rita Hauser discussed in 1971 have seen movement. However, as we have seen over the last several years, you can have rights and they can be taken away. Judicial attitudes can shift, and 8 states in 2019 passed anti-abortion legislation, with none of them going into effect, including Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban. This year, 2021, 61 abortion restrictions have passed since the start of the year. Women's bodies are subjected to more regulations than handguns. What is the reasoning behind this subordination and the need to define women as fundamentally different from men? Why is it that women's bodies are so widely regulated? In the article, If Men Could Menstruate by Gloria Steinman, she sarcastically describes how different things would be if men were the ones who could menstruate. Her jest includes these things that I've listed here, and while it's funny, the point that she makes is the characteristics of the powerful are better than the powerless. Let that sink in. That is the key, to keep others powerless. A white majority of the world has spent centuries conning us into thinking that a white skin makes people superior, even though the only thing that it really does is make them more subject to ultraviolet rays and to wrinkles. The characteristic of the powerful are thought to be better than the characteristic of the powerless, and logic has nothing to do with it. In some cultures, power over women's bodies is shown in oppressive practices such as female genital mutilation. This is a coming-of-age ritual where they cut away part of the girl's genitalia before they start puberty. The practice is widely regarded as oppressive to women and exemplifies how religions and cultures use their power of male dominance over women and mutilate her sexual organ, removing any pleasure from sexual intercourse. According to the World Health Organization, more than 90 million living girls and women have had this horrible procedure done to them. If the ERA is passed, wouldn't it make sense that female genital mutilation would no longer be allowed? Wouldn't the mutation of genitals be an area where full equality means that the traditional gender relations and cultural identities would have to be rethought? Well, I certainly hope so. In the article Women and Their Hair, author Rose White describes the power struggle over controlling others, and I've listed a few of her points here. She also quotes Michael Foucault. To carry out the tasks of modern economic and social life, societies require, quote, docile bodies. To create such bodies, disciplinary practices have evolved through which individuals both internalize and act on the ideologies that underline their own subordination. In turn, these disciplinary practices have made the body a site for power struggles and potentially for resistance, as individual choices about the body become laden with political meaning. As we discuss resistance to oppressive cultural norms and equal rights for women, I think it is important to note that the ERA doesn't actually say the word women. It says on account of sex. So this means all sexes would have to be treated equally under the law. In the 5 sexes, why male and female are not enough, Dr. Ann Foster-Sterling states how the two-sex system in our society does not cover the full spectrum of human sexuality. In it, she suggests a 5-sex system, and when it was written in 1993, it was widely criticized and also widely embraced as a groundbreaking material. Since then, we've seen a change in the way that people classify gender identity, including those gender-neutral bathrooms that worried so many. It is inevitable that the ramifications of the ERA would include debates around sexual orientation, since the basic definition of the sexes has changed. What that would mean exactly is anyone's guess. Much has changed in federal and individual state laws since the amendment was originally passed, so it could limit how much the ERA actually changes laws. However, the permanence of a federal Constitution amendment outweighs all other drawbacks. New generations are demanding equality, and a constitutional amendment is long overdue. The issues are part of the national debate and will continue to be as long as the struggle for control over others' bodies remains.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you again as well, Marla. It seems as though the first question has come in from our audience, and it's for you, Karen. So I'll try to summarize it as quickly as possible so there's time for questions for both of you. It's coming from Eileen, and she wants to know, she noticed that you left out specific mention of the draft concerning a potential implication of the ERA passing and being fully embraced. And she wants to know if that's a sticking point, or the facts that the courts have been using the 14th Amendment to adjudicate equality cases. She also provided some slightly more updated 2021 pay scale information that shows that when it's the same work, women make 98 cents to the dollar to men. But then it doesn't, but the lower rate doesn't consider same work credentials, that sort of thing. So just in light of her observations, do you have anything you want to say in response, and how to address these different disparities and potential unintended consequences or implications of what you're talking about?
Yeah, so some of it is time related, so you can't hit on every single point. I have not seen that study that she's mentioning, so I really can't comment on it because I haven't looked at it. I do know that some of the stuff that I looked at to update the presentation included some post-COVID numbers for women's pay, and they've gone down again. So I think it's a more complex situation than we even know, especially right now. A lot of women have even dropped out of the workforce because of COVID, and the loss of jobs in women's sectors is higher than it is for men. Women are often forced to stay home with the children and end up having to rely on welfare and unemployment in order to get by. They're marginalized in so many different ways, and women of color are marginalized even more than white women. So there's it's a very complex issue when it comes to equal pay and equal rights. And the only thing that can help is federal legislation to make it more equitable for everyone. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a complicated question that requires much more time, but it's a good start. I was just thinking as a question for both of you, and this might have to be something that we continue beyond the confines of this session, is that it's interesting that both of you are talking about the ways, well, in intersectionality in particular, right? Women not just looked at through one lens, particularly when you add in issues of race and class and other factors as well. But also this idea about how the narratives around issues that directly involve women and their characterizations have changed over time. And the role also, Marla, you in particular really were highlighting the role of female scholars and the work that women are doing to help add more nuance and complexity to that story. And Karen also trying to add more dimension to the picture so that the women whose names we might know, it's not necessarily as simple as they got together in upstate New York, some time passed, and eventually we had some laws that allowed things, right? The brutality that they experienced. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more from both of you about what you think about that in terms of the active ongoing work in scholarship that's occurring to add more dimension to these narratives, to help us understand these histories much better, and how intersectionality plays into that.
Marla, you want to take that one?
Sure. Karen, you alluded to the time factor. If I had presented my paper, I could have easily taken up double the time. But I think one of the things that I did cover that is interesting to that is Martin Luther King, of course, is an icon of the civil rights movement, but he himself set the narrative, like knowing that people would buy into the story of Rosa Parks more if she was, the fine, upstanding Christian woman that, he is putting forth. And we're going to gloss over the not so pretty facts of, like the history, the history from above, but this is the history from below. And I think that concept of microhistory around the civil rights era is really important because these stories have not been told. Gertrude Perkins was actually the reason that I came to this subject. I was listening to a podcast called Scene on Radio, which is a fascinating podcast out of Duke. And with that, if it weren't for her, they said there wouldn't be a bus boycott because her story, she was assaulted, but she went to her father and went to her pastor and, documented this. So the community, gathered, around her in that regard. So again, I don't want to lead us down the rabbit hole, but it absolutely intersectionality. It was a title of a slide that I actually cut because it's critical.
All right, well, and in the interest of time, we do have to wrap this up. But again, thank you both very much. And I appreciate the work that you did, that you shared with us today from your MLA classes. And hopefully we'll see ways in which it percolates in other research that you do during your time in the MLA program. All right, so we have a few minutes of for a break before we turn to our third session of the day. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in a few minutes.
Welcome back, everybody. This is it's 3:25 p.m. and we are on time for our third session today. Again, my name is Tristan Cabello. I am the Associate Director for the Master of Liberal Arts, and this specific panel is on the graduate project. As most of you know, the graduate project is a larger research project that you will complete towards the end of your studies in the MLA program. And today we have three very good examples of those projects to share with you. So we will start with Emily, if this is okay. Emily is presenting on health disparities in Chicago, a survey of 6 neighborhoods. And this is a project that I had the pleasure to supervise.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Cabello, for the introduction. I'm Emily, and today I'll be discussing my MLA capstone, which examines health disparities in the city of Chicago. In brief, my interest in studying health inequalities in the United States of America through ethnography started in undergrad when I read Mama Might Be Better Off Dead. It piqued my interest in understanding healthcare in urban USA, particularly Chicago, which is the setting of the book. Then when I started researching for the project, I found data published by the CDC, which demonstrates Chicago as having the largest gap in life expectancy. The numbers which particularly troubled me were the difference in life expectancy based on neighborhood of birth. In the wealthy Streeterville neighborhood, the average person lives to 90 years old, but just directly 9 miles south in Englewood, the life expectancy drops to 60. These neighborhoods are both a part of Cook County, so studying health disparities at the county level or even national misses big issues that happen within the city that could be leading to this disparity with only 9 miles apart. Ultimately, health inequalities are correlated with unequal distribution of resources and other social problems. The story of health disparities in Chicago is rooted in unequal access to resources and opportunities. Therefore, by investigating the neighborhoods, we can understand the story behind the aggregate data already gathered by entities like the CDC. Also, the use of county, state, or national data poses challenges and can mislead authorities to create initiatives that may not work well in resolving health disparities for Chicago specifically, as all urban areas contain idiosyncrasies that city officials need to be aware of. Okay, for some background, the next 3 slides I'll consider the role of race, socioeconomic status, also SES, and crime in the health disparities of Chicago. So first, let's consider the role of race. While Chicago, when looking at the population as a whole, is quite diverse, as you will see shortly in the results section, the neighborhoods are highly segregated. According to the 2010 census, the racial ethnic makeup of the city's 2.8 million population is 32.8% white, 30.1% Black or African American, 29% Hispanic, and 6.4% Asian. Despite the relative diversity, Chicago is the most segregated city in the United States of America. Race and socioeconomic status ought not to be important when it comes to life expectancy, but there's evidence that it plays a major role. Is it really entirely coincidental that Chicago is the most segregated city and has the largest gap in life expectancy and also is severely economically unequal? And just to give you some ideas about these images you might see on the slides too, I wanted to use them to show just how segregated it is. And you'll see I actually pulled the demographics for each of the neighborhoods I went in and studied later on, but just to give you a good visual to see that this hasn't been a new issue, but it's also not an issue that's been resolving. Okay, so when it comes to considering the role of socioeconomic status or SES in the health disparities of Chicago, while perhaps a Marxist perspective to examining health inequalities might help us to understand how equal distribution of resources can help in combating health disparities, there's previous research that shows that it doesn't actually explain all the differences in health outcomes we see. Specifically, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it, but there's this thing called the Whitehall studies in Britain. And that was one of the big reasons that I wanted to look at more than just income levels, but also how race and crime deterrence in the city can make a difference for health. So therefore, considering racial and ethnic segregation and crime rates that's the wrong one. Therefore, considering racial, ethnic segregation and crime rates might tell more to the story than income measures alone. For example, I found that mid-level SES neighborhoods had very similar health promoters as the high SES neighborhoods, despite difference in income level. The biggest difference is for the mid and high levels compared to that of low SES. But to get back to the background and not jump too far into conclusions, I'd like to point out that with racial segregation of neighborhoods, Chicago is also highly economically segregated. Okay, when it comes to considering the role of crime and health disparities of Chicago, this might sound a bit odd, but in recent scholarship, it is proving to be a pretty important variable in community health. There is evidence from previous studies demonstrating a connection between vulnerable populations, namely women and the elderly, to fear of victimization. Moreover, police relations need to be improved as there are serious negative health outcomes for psychological stress and fear of encountering police officers in these communities. Having social control agents present who do not increase anxiety could promote outdoor activity and reduce psychosocial stressors to living in high crime neighborhoods of Chicago. Okay, so for my methodology of this project, it was rather simple. For the selection process, I used the 77 recognized neighborhoods by the city of Chicago, then ordered them in terms of average income for each, and then clustered them into 3 SES levels, low, middle, and upper. After that, I used a random number generator to select 2 from each of these clusters. The 6 neighborhoods chosen were the 6 neighborhoods chosen using this multi-stage cluster sampling method were Loop, Near North, McKinley Park, Rogers Park, North Lawndale, and Washington Park. After the selection process, I found data on the race, ethnicity composition for each neighborhood. Lastly, I went to each of them and took notes of what I saw and experienced that day. Okay, so since I really don't have that much time, I'm going to go over briefly some of the results I found looking in these neighborhoods. In my actual paper, I separated them out because it's hard to compare North Lawndale and Washington Park and kind of group them as the same. But there are a lot of similarities in regards to the barriers of health that you'll see, and also some of the same things in promotion of health. So for the first thing I want to address are the pie charts you see on the right. These neighborhoods are extremely segregated. I mean, when you're looking at a neighborhood like Washington Park, where the main demographic is Black, non-Hispanic, making up 91.6%, and them having the lowest life expectancy, it becomes a racial issue for health. And that should never be the case because we know race is unimportant biologically and when it comes to health and life expectancy. So a couple of the promoters I saw in these neighborhoods were focused on community organizations and just mental health and focusing on events like supper clubs or really just trying to get together in ways that, especially because this was during COVID when I took the notes, being outdoors was pretty important. But a lot of the outdoor areas were not well maintained like you would see in the mid or high SES levels. And in their neighborhoods, there's a lot more care into the environment. So a couple of things that I saw, which were not very good for health, were the amount of liquor stores, quick marts, and lack of actual produce stores or produce anywhere. Also, a lot of the advertisements you'll see in these neighborhoods focus on liquor sales as opposed to banana sales or sales on chicken or asparagus, any kind of fresh produce. Also, a lot of the quick marts carry processed food or food that contains a lot of preservatives or high salt, high sugar content. Also, a big thing that I noticed was the iron bars over windows of both homes and businesses. I believe that really speaks to how people perceive their safety to be in these neighborhoods. So if there's a lack of safety or lack of perception of safety, they may not go outside and run outdoors and be active like the other neighborhoods more up north or in wealthier districts. Okay. So when it comes to the mid-SES neighborhoods, there were surprisingly very similar in regard to health promoters and barriers too. The biggest difference was the lack of dedicated health stores and health-focused restaurants compared to the high SES neighborhoods. And also the parks were a bit more run down and equipment was older, but at least in these neighborhoods, I did see kids out more and I saw more active behaviors and advertisements that were geared more towards health-oriented food choices and gyms. Also, I noticed a particular amount of community positive messages through the artwork in Rogers Park specifically. In Rogers Park, I saw one mural that read, Rogers Park, rich in history, rich in diversity. Moreover, on the wooden fencing that lined the physical park, which was called Tui Park, from a private resident, there was another mural which said, "Be kind, be mindful, get in good trouble." Again, these are just a few things, but I wanted to point them out today because there's much more to the story. I just want to be able to examine possible reasonings that, as a city as a whole, mid and high SES neighborhoods have more similarities than compared to the low SES when it comes to health promoters and barriers. Okay, so lastly, we have the upper SES, which demonstrated an extremely well-kept environmental areas and pedestrian travel. Even with regard to fast food, as more central downtown areas, there were more health-focused fast food options, specifically in forms of like healthy, what are they called, food trucks. So you could go and get like fresh acai bowls from a food truck as opposed to going to McDonald's, and it'd be just as quick. Also, there was a lot of room for pedestrian travel and bike travel, which I did not see in any other neighborhoods, not even the mid-SES ones. Also, a lot of restaurants and food stores catered to allergen friendliness and special diets like paleo or keto. And near north, there were numerous health food stores and gyms at almost every apartment complex I saw. Again, these are just a few things, but I wanted to go over them just to give you some of the results I saw. Okay, so I think I'm still okay on time. So in conclusion, my experience and systematic notes from these neighborhoods produce these major takeaways: that Chicago needs to address systematic and institutional racism. Police brutality against racial and ethnic minorities needs to go addressed. Racial ethnic segregation needs to be ended. Food nutrition availability and education. Access via transportation or local practices to healthcare. Access to and salaried job opportunities for heads of family. Treatment and upkeep of environment in low-income areas. Lastly, scholarship should consider to be conscientious of advancements in medical technology, serving as a source to possibly widen the gap in health, and use interdisciplinary scholars or collaboration amongst disciplines to examine this issue with a new perspective. Okay, that is everything. Thank you guys for watching.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was great. And so I think that Lisa is back online. So we'll have Lisa next. And Lisa Jackson is presenting on the role of the 1772 Somerset case in the American Revolution and how it galvanized enslaved Africans to fight. Thank you, Lisa.
Good afternoon. The title of my paper was The Role of the Somerset Case in the American Revolution and Its Role in Galvanizing Enslaved Africans. The 1772 Somerset case impacted the road to revolution for founders and impacted the actions of enslaved Africans during the war. James Somerset was enslaved in the British North American colonies and was taken to London by his enslaver, Charles Stuart. Somerset, with the help of English allies, escaped bondage, but was recaptured by agents acting on behalf of Stuart. He was taken to a ship bound for the Caribbean, where he would likely be sold into a more brutal form of enslavement, where his chances of escape were far slimmer. His allies became aware of his imprisonment and went to court to submit a petition for a writ of habeas corpus. Lord Chief Justice William Murray, the first Earl of Mansfield, issued a writ that permitted Somerset to remain free on bond until a hearing to adjudicate for his freedom was held. At the subsequent hearing, Lord Mansfield freed Somerset from bondage and carefully worded his ruling to only pertain to Somerset because he did not wish to set a precedent. However, despite his careful maneuverings, though his writing was overlooked by the press and onlookers, and the ruling was proclaimed as definitive affirmation that this case did not just free one enslaved man, but automatically freed every enslaved African who set foot onto terrestrial English soil. The ruling sent shockwaves throughout the North American colonies, who began to fear that the case was a harbinger of the winds of change and could jeopardize the future of legal slavery throughout all of the British Empire, including the North American colonies. The ruling fanned the flames of growing discontent among the North American colonists and affected the actions taken by enslaved Africans during the Revolutionary War, because many attempted to escape to make it to England to be freed, and many more were encouraged by the ruling to believe the British were so favorably disposed towards freeing the slaves that they escaped to the British lines. during the war with the hope that they would gain their freedom and gain their freedom. And it was among the founders. Conversely, the ruling was added to the list of growing tyrannies employed by the British Crown against its North American subjects. For a little bit more background, Somerset was born in Africa and kidnapped at some point during his childhood or teenage years, and was sent to Virginia, where he was sold to Stuart in 1749. Over the next 20 years, the two traveled to a variety of locales throughout North America and to the Caribbean, where Somerset witnessed more stringent and brutal forms of slavery than in the continental North American colonies. He also traveled to Boston, where some historians believe he may have been exposed to the nascent abolitionist movement. In 1769, he was taken to London. While there, he was baptized and made friends with several white Christians. When Somerset learned that Stuart was planning on leaving London and possibly going to the Caribbean, where he feared he would be sold, he freed himself and went into hiding. Stuart sent slave catchers after him, and they located him within 2 months. And upon his capture, he was stowed in the hold of the ship Anne and Mary, bound for Jamaica, where he correctly surmised Stuart planned to sell him as punishment. Somerset's kidnapping was witnessed by several abolition-minded Christians, and news of his kidnapping was conveyed to his friends and allies, who immediately submitted a writ of habeas corpus to have Somerset produced to the magistrate on December 9th, 1771. Based on his illegal abduction, a writ was served to Stuart and the captain of the Anne and Marie, who conversely submitted a right of return to the writ and complained that their property had been stolen. Granville Sharp, a noted attorney who was retained by Somerset's abolitionist friends to represent him, had been looking for a case to present before the court that would challenge the legality of any person being considered property under English common law, and decided that this was the case. He retained several co-counsel who all waived their fees in the case. However, Stuart's case was argued by lawyers obtained and paid for by a consortium of West Indian slavers and merchants who recognized the significance of the case. Although Lord Mansfield, who adjudicated the case, did not want to set a precedent, he firmly believed that the English common law did not give slaveholders the right to remove an enslaved individual from England to another destination where that individual could be sold against their will. Thus, he ruled to free Somerset. The fallout of the case was widely reported upon in Britain and colonial North America. At least 21 North American newspapers published 43 articles on the case. The historian Patricia Bradley concluded in her book, Slavery, Propaganda, and the American Revolution, that some of the media in North America purposely published misleading information on the case to state affirmatively that it freed any African once they were on terrestrial English soil, in an attempt to stir up mounting tensions and colonial anger towards mainland Britain. One pamphlet published in 1774, authored by an anonymous writer, and the pamphlet was called The Back Settler. It argued that the North American colonists had the same rights as Englishmen and prohibitions, and were subject to the same prohibitions and the same sanctions. He stated that general manumission would ruin many American provinces because he considered this Somerset case to definitively affect North America. Another slaver from Jamaica named Edward Long remarked that the case jeopardized slavery, and he said, quote, slave holding, it perhaps might be well discontinued in every province of the North American continent, end quote. He was also noted to say that the ruling would be an inducement to Africans to revolt or escape to Britain. However, historian William Cotter argued that the Somerset case and the abolition of slavery, it created the abolition of slavery in England, that it definitively ended slavery on English soil because the ruling stated that slavery could only be based on positive laws, i.e. laws established and not based on explicitly established and not based on common law or historical practice alone. Even founding father Benjamin Franklin commented on the case in the June 1772 London Chronicle by decrying the ruling and citing it as proof of English hypocrisy and which indicates the ire the case raised among founders. James Madison was so upset about the case that he argued the US should include a clause maintaining the mandatory return of any escaped African and cited this case as a reason. A number of enslaved Africans made attempts to get to England, and there was a contemporary advertisement for a runaway enslaved couple believed to be headed to England where they, quote, imagine they will be free, a notion now too prevalent among the Negroes, greatly to the vexation and prejudice of their masters. At the same time, another American colonist residing in England wrote to Charles Stewart after the ruling that one of his enslaved Africans, Mr. Dublin, received a letter from James Somerset on the ruling, so Dublin took it upon himself to free himself and take his own freedom. At the time, the London Chronicle also commented that in the wake of the Somerset ruling, many colonial owners of enslaved Africans would be less likely to bring them along when traveling to England. A pamphlet published in 1774 under the pseudonym Freeman informed enslaved Africans that they could obtain their freedom upon setting foot on quote, that happy territory where slavery is forbidden to perch. In Camille Davis's Why the Fuse Blew, The Reasons for Colonial America's Transformation from Proto-Nationalists to Revolutionary Patriots, 1772 to 1775, she cites instances where enslaved Africans in the colonies not only believed that the Somerset case freed the slaves in Britain, but there were plans to extend it to the colonies, and the arrival of British soldiers in 1772 was designed to enforce this ruling. The phenomenon of believing the case automatically freed slaves and the ramification of that became known as the Somerset effect. For instance, there were 4 enslaved Africans in Massachusetts who were influenced by the case to the extent that they decided to submit a petition for freedom by Massachusetts slaves on April 20th, 1773, that humbly requested a free day a week to hire themselves out to earn funds to purchase their freedom. Sadly, their modest request was denied. These incidents underscore the argument that enslaved Africans in the North American colonies had an awareness of the case and it impacted their actions. Enslaved Africans also spread the news of the Somerset case to each other, and along with the belief that it presaged freedom, and it spread quickly throughout the colonies to such an extent that John Adams made an entry in his diary while visiting South Carolina at the time that said, "The Negroes have a wonderful art of communicating intelligence among themselves. It will run hundreds of miles in a week or a fortnight." According to historian James Nadelhaft, the Somerset decision was misunderstood in 1772 because newspaper printers, readers, and almost everyone involved in the case had for 5 months been conditioned to think of it in a narrow, rigid pattern. The case had been hailed as the great Negro cause, the cause which would end only when the Chief Justice had ruled on slavery's legality. The case was built up as one involving a central issue of slavery or freedom for all England slaves, not simply for one who could not be dodged by legal subtleties. Somerset's lawyers and Lord Mansfield created this thought pattern, and because of it, when Somerset was discharged from custody, it was assumed that all had been freed. A number of enslaved Africans also viewed the case as a larger set of British actions that signaled a possible coming of abolition. Historian Simon Sharma contends that British leaders in North America were aware of the Africans' belief that the British intended to free them due to the Somerset case's effect, and utilized this against North American colonists. The earliest and most blatant example of this occurred when Lord Dunsmore, the final British colonial governor of Massachusetts, issued his November 7, 1775 declaration that promised freedom to any enslaved Africans who elected to fight with the British. Several other British leaders, such as Generals Howe and Clinton, followed suit and made similar promises to enslaved Africans willing to fight for the British and accepted. And their acceptance included taking women and children who crossed British lines in their promises for slavery as well. Ironically, after Lord Dunsmore's declaration, George Washington hypocritically and unironically called his lordship that arch traitor to the rights of humanity for promising freedom to the enslaved who would fight with the British without himself recognizing the inhumanity of maintaining slavery. Paradoxically, of course, later Washington decided to employ the services of enslaved Africans to fight with the North Americans, and they had a far lower number of African recruits than the British did, and Washington blamed his decision to allow any blacks to fight in the Revolutionary War the fault of the British. According to estimates made by Thomas Jefferson, later confirmed by modern historians, approximately 30,000 enslaved Africans escaped from Virginia plantations to reach the British lines. Although not every enslaved African who escaped from plantations went to the British, it is estimated that between 80 and 100,000 escaped overall between 1775 and 1787 throughout the course of the Revolution. A similar pattern of enslaved Africans fleeing to the British lines to fight for freedom was repeated during the War of 1812. Even shortly before the American Civil War, A.T. Jones, a formerly enslaved African born in 1814 and living in Canada, told a British journalist in 1863, "Ever since my first recollection, the only source that colored people looked to for deliverance was the British government. They prayed that there might come a war or something between the two countries by which the British government would destroy slavery. That was the talk among the slaves." Sadly, the English were not to be the great emancipators that many enslaved Africans hoped for in the wake of the Somerset case. And unhappily, status quo was maintained, and auctions of sales of enslaved Africans continued throughout the colonies and in London itself for several decades to come. However, by the war's end, at least 14,000 North American blacks left with King George III's army from New York to settle in places such as Halifax, Canada, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Nassau, Bahamas, and England. In addition, an additional 4,500 Black refugees fled with the British from South Carolina and Georgia to East Florida. Some enslaved Africans who fought with the British were not so fortunate, and if they were captured by Americans, they were evaluated and sent to the Caribbean or Central America to be sold and enslaved in generally harsher conditions. And their American owners were provided recompense for their property. So although the British kept some of their promises, the ultimate British defeat, and because many enslaved Africans who wished to join them were unable to make it to the British lines and subsequently escape with them, slavery remained the rule of the day, and millions of Africans remained in bondage. The Somerset case played an important role in shaping the fate of the British North American colonies. It sparked concerns among some of the soon-to-be revolutionaries about the security of their investment in slavery by raising the possibility that freeing Africans was a distinct possibility, and became one of the many factors that ignited the revolution. In addition to affecting revolutionaries, enslaved Africans in the North American colonies in England utilized the case as a method to attempt to gain freedom. The importance of maintaining enslavement to the founding fathers belies the validity of their claim to wish to create a free democracy, and the modern inability to recognize this also raises questions about the nation's willingness to come to terms with these truths. And that is my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was great. And we have one final presentation today. It's by Cody Ferris, and the title of our presentation is "The White Story, but Not the Whole Story, the Case for the Inclusion of Diverse Literary Requirements in American Undergraduate English Programs." Cody, we are ears.
Hi, everybody. So, like Dr. Cabello said, my name is Cody Ferris, and I'm graduating from the MLA program. I did my research on the need for the inclusion of diverse literary requirements, as literature and racial equity are two topics that I'm very passionate about, and being able to challenge and pursue the need for anti-racist curriculum and social justice in higher education is something that I was really excited to explore. So I'm very excited to be here to share this with you, and let's get started. So I'm going to go through a quick agenda with you before we move on. So I'm first going to talk about the grand old literary tradition, or the literary canon, and some of the problems that arise with the canon. I'll then dive into my data for my research capstone and go over the following 4 universities that you can see on the screen and some of the problems that they have in their literature curriculum. I'll then talk about 2 case studies on moderately successful programs. They're successful in different ways. And I'll conclude with some final thoughts. Okay, so for the grand old literary tradition, you see 3 very obviously white authors on the screen. On the left, you have Goethe, who wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther. In the center, you have Shakespeare, probably very recognizable. And on the right, you have F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby. Now, the Eurocentric canon, or what I call the Eurocentric canon, as in the combination of the literary canons that are dominated by white authors, is represented by men and a few women like this. And this creates a problem that we might call a single narrative ideology, where students enter into a literature program at an undergraduate university. They study literature, they get an idea of how to critically analyze different topics and themes, and they come out really only knowing a scope of literature represented by white people and European white people, right? And this can become a problem, as the history of the collection of literary history that exists worldwide goes far beyond that of simple whiteness. And we can call this, one of the studies that I cited in my research, calls this white ownership of the humanities. And this creates problems because it teaches students, and I'm specifically focusing on white students, as I am a white person and I can never claim and will never claim to know what it is like to be a student of color. It teaches white students that a canon that shows only white perspectives is what's normal. It's what's representational of all of literature. It ignores the countless works by Black, Indigenous, and other authors of color who have incredible narratives to share, and it therefore skips out on a huge element of literary history and therefore world history. So why would a student exiting a literature program think of literature by authors of color or racially diverse literature when a panel of white authors is all that they've been taught? So the current state of affairs at the following 4 universities is unfortunate. And I chose these universities as they are all across the nation in different states on different parts of the country. And they represent a diverse selection of public universities. And what you can see here is that the ratio of diverse courses to Eurocentric courses in the offered catalogs of each of these programs is unfortunately not up to scratch. At the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, for every 1 racially diverse course that is offered, there are 5 Eurocentric courses offered, which means that students have a very low chance of actually attending a course that can teach them about the lives, the narratives, and the experiences of people of color. And excuse me, white students, I need to be very specific about this when I'm talking about this. As I said before, this sets up the white single narrative ideology as the norm, and it perpetuates systemic racism where white is default both inside and outside of academia. Now, part of this, I included the potentially diverse courses, which can include things like early American literature, some world literature, etc. Now, one of the studies I cited unfortunately showed that only about 50% of instructors are either comfortable or willing to even approach those particular topics from a diverse perspective. So the numbers on the far right column, where it includes potentially diverse courses, that's an ideal situation. In reality, it's a lot less. So we're given an example of a program that is several programs that are not equitable to all students and do not accurately reflect the current state of and the historical state of the world. Now, there is a lot of data, and this is a very, very brief overview. Otherwise, I would absolutely run out of time. but I would happily answer further questions about this. Now, at the University of Utah, we have an example that's a little bit better. Utah does require a diverse course. So every student in the literature program must attend one diverse course. Now, this doesn't seem like a lot, but one thing that the University of Utah does well is that they include other racially diverse courses in their other course requirements. So where other universities don't have any racially diverse courses required whatsoever and rarely offer them, Utah actually places those inside other categories. So if you take post-1800s literature, you are going to find an equal ratio of classes about different authors of color versus white authors, right? So there's a decent representation. Now, this sounds great. However, they still have room to grow. And this chart that you see here is the breakdown of their fall 2018 and spring 2019 schedules. And so while their catalog proffers an abundance of diverse courses and sets up some great structure, in reality, there isn't very much for us to be going off of. There aren't very many diverse courses scheduled for students to attend. There's about a 25% less chance of students attending a racially diverse course. So they have room to grow, but they're still stuck in a rather narrow structure. Now, this isn't about English literature, but it's very difficult to find case studies about literature programs simply because the canon is so all-encompassing that it's not often done. But one university that unfortunately wasn't specified in the study diversified a 2-course sequence on organic chemistry. And what the instructors did is they combined learning about diversity in chemistry with learning about diversity in society and in the workplace. And so what wound up happening is at the end of this sequence, they surveyed all of the students and they found that students came out being more empathetic, more open-minded, less colorblind to race, and more validating of the experience of people of color and both inside and outside of academia. And this is recognized the importance of diversity in college as well as in their future careers. And interestingly enough, this is something that is often desired in corporate America because corporate America is beginning to acknowledge the fact that diversity and inclusion and equity creates innovation. So sticking with the current status quo where we are living in this space where white is default and white is the majority when it comes to literature, it's no longer going to work. Now, both of these programs are good, right? We have the University of Utah, which has great structure, and we have this 2-course chemistry sequence, which also has a great structure. However, of course, chemistry is not about an English program. But if we combine the two and we combine Utah's structure with the success of a diversified course like the organic chemistry sequence, we have the potential to develop a new model. And this has been recognized, or the humanities have been recognized to teach students to be open-minded, empathetic, egalitarian. It promotes democracy. It teaches students to challenge the norm. In this case, in the scope of my research, the white norm. And like I said, businesses understand diversity is critical for innovation and success. So many aspects of our society no longer wish to follow the old model of absolute exclusivity, where people of color are excluded from our narratives and from our society as a whole. So combining a program outline such as Utah with the success of the courses like the organic chemistry sequence, we could actually achieve some excellence. So I'm going to close out with a quote that fueled me through this entire process. And I highly recommend, if you haven't seen her TED Talk before, Chimamanda Adichie tells an incredible story about her experiences with single narratives. So she says, stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. And this is something that I fundamentally believe, because the power of literature is to teach us to analyze the experiences and the perspectives of other people. And if we only focus on a narrative that is structured around a single race, around the white majority, right? Then we are leaving out so much of our society, all of the people who also live here and have experiences. And this only perpetuates the systemic racism that we read about every day in the media. So fighting this through education, through higher education, which is where I believe that all of this needs to begin, is what I believe to be the first step into taking on a lot of these problems. Thank you.
Cody, thank you very much. It was a great presentation. I just want to say, tell the audience that they can send their question to the panelists. Cody, a question for you maybe. Do you, since the rebirth of the Black Lives Matter movement, last June, have you seen any improvement here? I mean, it seems that a lot of Department of Education all over the US, have tried to diversify their curriculum. Did you see, is this moving in the right direction according to you?
Yes and no. There are a lot of universities that are actually incorporating specific literature about the Black Lives Matter movement, which is excellent. There are several articles that are concerned about whether that's going to stick or whether it's more of a PR play, right? One of the studies that I utilized in my research, I'm not going to repeat any of the specific comments, but it had some comments specifically from instructors about teaching topics about diversity. And the comments were, they were atrocious. They were horrible. And the study was done at the beginning of last year. So I think there's a lot of movement in terms of universities starting to set the framework for this. I think there's still a lot of room for growth in terms of getting instructors on board and changing curriculum. But I think we're definitely in the infancy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Cody. We have a good question here for Emily too. Are there any avenues apparent to rectify the disparities in amenities and access to fresh produce, which have identifiable health impacts, while also resisting cries of gentrification and move towards equality?
Hey, so yes, you make a great point with the gentrification issue. That's what makes a lot of the issue with food accessibility so challenging, is because in order to get a lot of those health food oriented places into these neighborhoods, there needs to be wealth and education to understand why perhaps having time to create this dinner, or even having time to create dinner, if you are working 2 shifts or you don't have a lunch break where a boss will even allow you to do these things, it's such a complex, large issue that can go into so many different domains of the workforce domain, of the education domain. So I don't think there's really one avenue other than having community organizations come through, whether it's gardening in a certain area downtown, or if it's programs starting in elementary or middle schools to tell you about the benefits of reducing sugar intake, or having open and honest conversations about I know there's I didn't really get to talk about this in my presentation, but in a lot of health inequality research, there's a paradox where the people who are most obese are also the ones who are most nutriently deprived. So people are thinking like, oh, you don't have a food desert. 50% of the population is overweight or obese, or more than that. But it's so much more complicated. So I guess that's kind of a long-winded answer to say there's just too many avenues, but they all could use some work.
Thank you so much, Emily. So we're right on time. I just want to thank you all, guys, for your presentations. They were great, and this is really a good transition to the next step in this colloquium, because in 20 minutes we will have our keynote speaker, and Michael Benson, as you know, has also completed his capstone in the MLA program, and has actually published a book about his capstone that is based on his capstone, and he will present his research in 20 minutes. Thank you very much.